All right, welcome back. You have brought quite the stack of sources this week. Looks like you've been busy digging into a massive amount of information across, well, everything.
It truly is a diverse collection. We're looking at everything from the microscopic world of computing using what are essentially lab-grown neurons.
Wow.
Stretching out to the vastness of space and its geopolitical implications, diving into market forecasts, and even tracking subtle but, fascinating shifts in societal trends.
And our mission, as always, is to jump right into this material, pull out the most important insights, those truly surprising facts, and help you see the connections you might have missed when just skimming the headlines.
Exactly. The goal here is to help you cut through all that noise and see the bigger picture woven through these seemingly disparate topics. It's complex, but that's where the deep dive becomes really valuable.
Absolutely. We've got news on the future of computing that sounds straight out of sci-fi. What's happening way up in orbit and how it affects things right here on the ground. Global dynamics that are literally moving markets and reshaping warfare, and some fascinating takes on business and what's happening in society itself. It's a lot, but that's exactly what we're here to unpack. Let's jump in. So let's kick off with some of the truly mind-bending technology highlighted in these sources. Forget the silicon chip for a second. We're talking about computers made of biological material.
That's right. One source introduces the CL1 biocomputer from Cortical Labs. It's presented as the world's first biocomputer, utilizing lab-grown human brain cells. We're talking about around 800,000 neurons.
Wait, 800,000 human brain cells in a computer. That fundamentally changes what we think of as computation.
It really does. And the key insight here is energy efficiency. A human brain operates on roughly 20 watts. Compare that to projections for future AI data centers needing an estimated, well, a staggering 1580 terawatt hours annually by 2034.
1580 terawatt hours. That highlights the massive efficiency gap that biological systems could potentially bridge.
Precisely.
But how do they even get these neurons to compute anything? Are they just in a dish?
Well, they use brain organoids, which are these miniaturized 3D cell structures grown from human stem cells. And the dish brain experiment mentioned in the source, it demonstrated their capability to learn.
Learn how?
They literally taught this network of neurons to play Pong using a reward and punishment system. It's based on something called the free energy principle.
Brain cells playing Pong using rewards, okay? That is a powerful demonstration of their learning potential, even if it sounds completely wild. The source notes it cost $35,000.
Yeah, around that. Which, is kind of like early personal computer costs, maybe hinting at future accessibility.
True.
It's a significant step, definitely raising profound questions about intelligence and maybe even consciousness outside traditional machines.
And it's not just biology pushing boundaries. The sources also talk about physics doing the same thing with quantum computing.
Absolutely. We saw recent papers from Quora and Google in Nature highlighting a really significant advance using quantum computers to simulate particle string breaking.
String breaking? What exactly does that mean, and why is it such a big deal?
Okay, think of fundamental particles, like quarks, being held together by force fields.
Yeah.
Sort of like tiny, powerful rubber bands or strings. When you try to pull them apart, the energy builds in that string until, pop, it snaps, creating new particles. Simulating this incredibly complex subatomic interaction in real time is something classical computers really, really struggle with.
And quantum computers can actually model this.
Yes, and what's interesting is the different approaches mentioned. Quora used an analog simulation with cold atoms in a grid, while Google used a digital simulation with superconducting loops.
Different methods, same result.
Kind of. The insight is that regardless of the specific method, these machines are starting to model physics previously out of reach. It's opening doors for simulations in high-energy physics and potentially material science using maybe more complex units than qubits, sometimes called qubits.
So we're seeing fundamental shifts in how we compute, from biological to quantum approaches. But what about the AI software everyone talks about? The sources had some surprising findings there too, right?
They did. One source detailed this private meeting where top mathematicians were genuinely challenged by OpenAI's O4 Mini chatbot.
A chatbot challenging leading mathematicians. That's not what I expected at all.
Neither did they. Ken Ono, a prominent mathematician mentioned in the source, he observed colleagues felt the bot seemed to approach mathematical genius. It apparently solved a PhD-level problem he gave it really quickly.
Wow. So beyond just generating text, it's showing real problem-solving capability in a very specialized field.
That's the takeaway. The Frontier Math Benchmark, which tests challenging math problems, showed older models could only tackle about, 2% of the questions. Reportedly, by April 2025, O4 Mini, perhaps using a new training method, was hitting around 20%.
20%, it's a huge jump.
It is. And the mathematicians felt this mix of awe at its speed and proficiency, but also, some concern about the future of human creativity in the field. Where does that leave us?
Yeah, that's amazing. And maybe a little intimidating.
It's definitely a mix of excitement and concern. Appreciating the tool, but questioning AI's potential dominance and the need to keep nurturing human ingenuity.
AI tackling hard math is one thing, but what about practical, messy, real-world problems, like the growing issue of waste? Did the sources touch on that?
Yes, they did. The sources also highlight an exciting application from research in China focused on reviving dead lithium-ion batteries.
Reviving dead batteries, that sounds incredibly useful, especially with the rise of EVs.
It is. And the scale of the problem is just massive. EV battery waste is projected to hit 20.5 million metric tons by 2040. That's up from 900,000 just this year. China alone deals with millions of tons annually. The real insight here is how AI was used.
Okay, how did AI help with this specifically?
Well, a machine learning model was trained on a whole bunch of electrochemical data to identify potential molecules that could sort of reintroduce lithium ions into depleted battery cells. It pinpointed one specific electrolyte, lithium trifluoromethane sulfonate, as a really promising candidate.
And did it work? What were the results?
Pretty remarkable, actually. When they added this to an electrolyte, experiments with LFP cells, that's lithium iron phosphate, showed batteries could regain up to 96% capacity after nearly 12,000 cycles.
12,000 cycles? That's way beyond their typical lifespan, isn't it?
Absolutely. The source suggests it might work for NMC batteries, too, the other common type. And they're even exploring commercial ideas like battery boosting stations. This is a major potential breakthrough for, the circular economy and waste reduction.
Okay, so AI is pushing the boundaries of computation, tackling hard math, and even helping solve critical waste problems. But the sources also look at the even bigger picture of AI, AGI, the future of work. What are the leaders saying?
Right. We heard perspectives from people like Demis Hassabis of DeepMind and Sundar Pichai of Google Alphabet. Hassabis gave artificial general intelligence, AGI, a 50% chance of being achievable in the next 5 to 10 years.
That timeline feels really close. But is AI truly ready for AGI? Or are we still seeing limitations?
Well, both acknowledge it's not exactly a smooth path. The Hassabis notes current AI's inconsistency. Sometimes it fails really basic tasks while excelling at complex ones. Pichai calls this jagged intelligence.
Jagged intelligence, I like that.
Yet the insight here is that it's incredibly powerful, but still unpredictable in its capabilities across the board. It's not uniformly smart yet.
So what's the upside they see, assuming we get there? And what are the major concerns they raise?
They see enormous potential for radical abundance. That's Hassabis' term, breakthroughs in medicine, energy, general well-being. And Pichai talks about enhancing human cognitive abilities and creativity. But they are equally clear on the risks. Misuse, especially by rogue actors, is a big one. And the urgent need for smart international regulation to try and manage that risk.
And what about the impact on jobs? That's always a huge question with AI.
Hassabis believes jobs will definitely transform, but he draws on history, suggesting technological shifts have always created new opportunities eventually. The challenge, highlighted in the sources, is the societal shift needed to adapt to this potential abundance and transformation equitably. How do we distribute the benefits?
Right. That's the key question.
And Pichai added an interesting thought that with resource abundance, maybe essential human values like kindness and empathy might emerge more prominently. Less scarcity, perhaps more cooperation.
An optimistic take. So, a future shaped by increasingly powerful AI, potentially reaching general intelligence, built on new kinds of hardware, solving new problems, but also forcing us to confront major questions about ethics, economics, and society itself. What takeaway stands out most to you from this rapidly changing tech landscape? Let's pivot sharply now, because the sources paint a picture of a world grappling with ongoing conflict and rapidly shifting power dynamics, and this is reaching all the way into space.
Yes, the military dimension is certainly prominent. One source analyzes Ukraine's drone attacks deep within Russia.
Attacks inside Russia with drones. How does that change the picture? What's the significance there?
Well, military experts quoted in the source see it as fundamentally challenging Russia's perceived geographic invulnerability. It shows that defenses aren't impenetrable, and it highlights this concept of charitable precision mass.
Charitable precision mass. Explain that.
It means using lots of inexpensive drones, to destroy very high-value assets. The key insight here is that this signals a potentially significant shift away from traditional, expensive mechanized warfare. It could make older, costly systems like the F-35 fighter jet that was mentioned more vulnerable or maybe even obsolete in certain contexts.
It really does sound like the nature of warfare is undergoing a radical change, driven by this kind of technology.
It is, and naturally there's a race to develop countermeasures. The sources mention the U.S. Army's work on microwave blasters, like the Leonidas system demonstrated in a Philippines exercise recently.
Microwave blasters, so high-tech defense trying to counter a low-cost offense.
Precisely. Traditional jamming often doesn't work against modern drones that might use fiber optics or advanced AI for navigation. So microwave weapons fire these intense pulses designed to disrupt or destroy the drone's electronics.
A zap gun for drones, essentially.
Kind of, yeah. This tech is being pursued by multiple companies, and the sources suggest it offers a potential way to counter not just swarms, but possibly even subsonic cruise missiles. That's a significant development.
Moving from drones to regional tensions, the sources also showed the Israel-Iran conflict heating up significantly.
They detail recent Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities like Natanz and also targeting military leaders. These are framed in the sources as a response to Iran's nuclear ambitions, particularly the concern about Tehran achieving breakout capability.
What does breakout capability mean in this context, and why is it such a critical point right now?
It's basically the point where Iran could quickly produce enough weapons-grade enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon. The sources explain that Iran possesses about 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% U-235 that's very close to weapons grade.
How close?
With their advanced IR-6 centrifuges, the sources report they could potentially produce the material for one weapon in just 2 to 3 days, maybe 9 weapons in 3 weeks. So the strikes are seen as an attempt to disrupt or delay that capability.
And this has major implications for global markets, right? The sources definitely discussed oil prices.
Absolutely. The oil price surge right after the strikes, Brent crude jumped 8% to $74 a barrel, shows just how sensitive markets are to these tensions. One source mentioned JP Morgan Chase projections, suggesting prices could exceed $120 a barrel if the conflict escalates and targets oil production sites in Gulf countries.
$120 a barrel.
Yeah. The potential for losing Iranian exports or, in a worst-case scenario, closing the Strait of Hormuz. It creates immense market volatility and risk.
Okay, shifting from Earth-based conflicts to the challenges of getting to space, the sources highlighted some recent difficulties with lunar landings. Another setback.
Yes, IS-Space, the Japanese company, unfortunately lost its second lunar lander named Resilience. The insight here, I think, is that lunar landings remain incredibly challenging, even with multiple commercial efforts now. It's still really hard.
That's their second loss, right? Was it the same issue as the first time?
No, apparently a different issue, according to the source. The first one was attributed to a software problem. This time, it seems a rangefinder issue caused a delay in measurements, meaning it hit the surface too early at a pretty high speed, like 187 kilometers per hour.
Ouch.
Yeah. It carried interesting payloads, too, like a rover and a food experiment. But despite these setbacks, eSpace is planning new landers, Apex 1.0 and Series 3, showing persistence in a really difficult domain.
And once you are there, or traveling further out, the sources discuss the need for more power in space. Way more power.
Exactly. For missions far beyond Mars where solar power becomes really weak, you need significant power sources. Historically, we've relied on small radioisotope generators, RTGs like on Voyager. They produce maybe 100 watts. Barely enough for basic systems.
Right.
A report mentioned in the sources analyzes the critical role of nuclear fission reactors for future missions.
Why is fission suddenly becoming so important?
Because you need substantial power, potentially kilowatts or even megawatts, for things like running industrial processes maybe on the moon or generating propellant on Mars from local resources. The insight is that ambitious future space exploration and utilization likely requires this fundamental shift in how we power our systems beyond Earth orbit.
And bringing it back home, space is a major topic for U.S. lawmakers and not without its own debates and controversies.
Definitely. The sources highlight bipartisan support for increasing the U.S. Space Force budget, nearly $29 billion proposed for fiscal year 2026. But there's a clear divide over this project called Golden Dome.
Golden Dome, what's the controversy there?
It's a proposed satellite constellation for missile detection and interception. The concern raised by some Democratic lawmakers, according to the source, is that it could unnecessarily escalate an arms race in space. There's also frustration over perceived lack of clarity on the program's details, despite House Republicans allocating $25 billion for it.
So even defense in space is a point of political friction. And geopolitics can get personal, too. The Trump-Musk feud was mentioned as impacting U.S. space programs. How so?
It's a prime example of how political dynamics can interact with critical national infrastructure. SpaceX is just fundamental to U.S. space efforts right now, transporting NASA astronauts, launching most DoD payloads, providing Starlink services vital in places like Ukraine.
So the U.S. is very reliant on SpaceX.
Extremely reliant. The insight is that this reliance on a single private entity, however innovative, creates vulnerability. Threats from political figures like Trump to revoke contracts, or even suggestions of nationalization from people like Steve Bannon mentioned in the source, they expose this risk. And you saw Tesla's share price drop, reflecting that market anxiety.
And Trump also signed some executive orders related to the broader aerospace sector just recently.
Yes, on June 11th.
Yeah.
They seem focused on revitalizing areas like drones, flying cars, EV calls, and supersonics. The stated goal is cutting regulatory gridlock, boosting domestic production, reducing foreign reliance.
Any specific actions mentioned?
A key aspect mentioned is facilitating routine operations like flying drones beyond the pilot's visual line of sight, BVLOS. That's crucial for things like package deliveries. They're also apparently launching a pilot program for flying cars and trying to improve security against drone misuse.
So from the extreme technical difficulty of lunar landings and the strategic push for nuclear power in space, to political feuds impacting critical space capabilities and new regulations trying to jumpstart entire new aviation sector space is clearly a complex, contested, and rapidly evolving domain. What insights does all this offer you about the global landscape right now? Let's bring it back down to earth and into our everyday lives, specifically markets, business, and how people are adapting to a changing world. The sources have some pretty optimistic takes on investment opportunities, surprisingly so, perhaps.
They certainly do seem quite bullish. One source highlights a significant growth period for investors recently. The speaker in that source actually mentioned their public account growing from around $1.1 million to nearly $3.4 million in about 2.5 to 3 years.
That kind of growth definitely gets your attention. It's remarkable.
It is, and the sources introduced this unique proposal called MAGI accounts.
MAGA accounts. Okay, what's the idea behind those?
It apparently stands for Money Accounts for Growth and Advancement. The proposal is for a $1,000 government seed investment for kids born between 2025 and 2028, with an option for parents or guardians to add another $5,000 annually.
Into the stock market.
Yes. The source projects this could bring approximately $3.6 billion annually into the stock market, just based on current birth rates, a new potential stream of capital.
Interesting. And the sources seem pretty bullish on U.S. stocks, specifically over other assets.
Very bullish, yeah. They strongly advocate for U.S. stocks over alternatives like Bitcoin, gold, international stocks, even real estate in some contexts. The sentiment presented is that investors really need to adapt to persistently elevated price-to-earnings, or PE, ratios.
Meaning stocks are expensive relative to earnings, but maybe that's the new normal.
That's the view in the source, yes. That this is a potentially sustainable norm, not necessarily a signal to sell everything. They highlight the ongoing tech rally, particularly semiconductors, and expect a NASDAQ summer rally based on historical trends showing like a 12% average gain in the second half of the year usually.
But any caution?
Yes, caution advised on small-cap stocks, mainly due to interest rate sensitivity.
Were there any specific companies or areas spotlighted that caught your eye in these bullish takes?
Several were mentioned. NVIDIA was given a pretty optimistic forecast, maybe 340, 370 by 2030, based on earnings growth scenarios. Waymo, Google's self-driving cars, was seen as actually benefiting from that LA protest publicity where a car got torched.
Benefiting? How?
The source argued it generated over $100 million in free marketing value, despite the minimal actual damage to Waymo itself. A strange but notable take. Meta was mentioned for potential multi-billion-dollar investment talks with Scale AI, and their Meta glasses with live translation were floated as a potential killer app.
A killer app in AR glasses, that's been elusive, hasn't it?
It has. But maybe live translation is compelling enough. We'll see. AMD was highlighted for having potential to exceed $200 a share, cited with a low PE ahead of their advancing AI event. The Cheesecake Factory, or Cake as the company's called, was noted for growth prospects beyond just the restaurants.
Cheesecake Factory, okay.
Yeah, and various drone stocks like Archer Aviation, Joby Aviation, and Dragonfly, along with aerospace ETFs, were expected to benefit from those new regulatory changes we discussed earlier.
What about Tesla? You mentioned the Trump feud impacting them, but were there other operational issues discussed?
Yes, Tesla's share price dropped initially after the Trump comments, but the company is also facing operational challenges mentioned in the sources. Things like an aging vehicle lineup compared to new competitors, and increased competition overall contributing to a sales decline in Q1.
So real business headwinds.
Right. The insight here is the contrast between these current struggles and Elon Musk's incredibly ambitious robotaxi plan for Austin, targeting a June 22nd launch and millions of vehicles by the second half of 2026. The sources note significant regulatory hurdles for that plan, and that Waymo incident also kind of highlights the operational risks in the robotaxi space. It's a big bet.
So lots of potential investment upside flagged in the sources, but also significant risks and shift happening in the business world. The sources also looked at challenges facing some established giants, right? Like Apple?
Yes, Apple under Tim Cook was discussed with a somewhat critical lens. One source even drew a comparison to Nokia's decline, which is pretty stark.
Nokia. Wow, what's the argument?
The argument presented is that Apple is stagnating in AI. They cited a postponed Siri overhaul and pointed to rivals exploring things like AI smart glasses, while Apple seems more reactive, focusing maybe on foldable phones or the Vision Pro investment.
So the Vision Pro isn't seen as leading the AI charge.
The source suggests the investment in VR might provide expertise down the line, but it feels reactive compared to what others are doing, specifically with AI glasses integrated into daily life. Apple's strict privacy policies are also seen as potentially limiting its ability to use data for competitive AI development.
Yeah.
And there are risks mentioned to its massive services revenue from things like Google search payments being scrutinized and App Store challenges.
So it's framed as a really critical moment for Apple needing some strategic revitalization.
That's just, yeah.
And Nintendo is facing its own pivotal moment with the Switch successor, another high-stakes situation.
Absolutely. Nintendo relies incredibly heavily on the Switch's success. Nearly 152 million units sold, stock at highs. The huge gamble is on the Switch 2 needing to somehow surpass that phenomenal success.
That's a tall order.
It is. The source brings in lessons from Nintendo's own history. Massive hits like the NES, DS, and Wii, but also notable failures like the Wii U, often attributed to confusing branding and poor timing. The insight is that even if the Switch 2 feels more like an iterative upgrade, the strategy builds heavily on the existing Switch legacy, which accounts for something like 93–95% of Nintendo's current revenue.
So they can't afford a Wii U moment.
Exactly. The stakes are incredibly high. Though the Super Mario movie's huge success does provide a nice brand boost and maybe shows diversification potential.
These examples show established giants navigating massive change. What about the workforce itself? Any insights there?
There's an interesting piece critiquing the nostalgic view of factory jobs in America. You hear that talked about a lot.
Yeah, bringing back manufacturing jobs.
Right. But the source highlights the reality. Manufacturing jobs are now less than 10% of U.S. employment. That's down from nearly 25% back in the 1970s. Largely due to automation.
So even if manufacturing comes back, the jobs won't return in the same numbers or form.
That's the argument. The source argues that even significant reshoring won't bring back the proportional job numbers from decades past because factories are just so much more automated now. Instead, it suggests looking at alternative careers that offer some aspects of the old good job model.
Like what?
Skilled trades. Electricians, mechanics, plumbers, they offer good wages, often potential for unionization, and don't necessarily require a 4-year degree. The insight is that while they lack the old localized factory boost for an entire town, they provide a similar kind of stability and career path. It's seen as the evolution of solid work as prosperity grows and industries inevitably change.
Interesting perspective. And beyond work, the sources touch on fascinating shifts in society and even belief systems, something unexpected.
Yes, here's a really surprising finding from one source. The long-term trend of the West, particularly the U.S. and Europe, losing religion seems to have slowed or even reversed, especially among young people, Gen Z.
Reversed. Really, that goes against a lot of the prevailing narrative over the last decade or two.
It does. Among young Americans, identification as Christian reportedly rose from 45% in 2023 to 51% in 2024. And there have been notable spikes in adult baptisms in Europe, too, in places like France and Norway.
Why? What's driving that according to this source?
The source suggests the COVID-19 pandemic might have played a significant role driving a search for meaning, community, maybe stability, particularly among younger generations who experience significant disruption. It just highlights the resilience and adaptability of religious belief in unexpected ways.
That is genuinely unexpected. Any other shifts in social or political identity discussed in the material?
One source briefly touches on the debate about the woke right in America. It's presented very much as an internal discussion happening within conservative circles.
The woke right, how is that defined in the source? Is it like horseshoe theory?
Sort of drawing on that idea, yeah. It's described as some observers seeing a segment of the right mirroring the left's focus on oppression narratives, but inverting them, portraying groups like straight, white, Christian men as victims of perceived international liberalism or globalism. The source notes it's a debated label causing internal factionalism, with others preferring terms like illiberal conservatism or even MAGA Maoism. The key is the source reports on this as a debate happening within that political sphere, not taking a side itself.
Okay, reporting on an internal debate. Got it. And finally, there was a really counterintuitive study about how our minds work when we're not fully focused.
Yes, this was fascinating. This study suggests that letting your mind wander during simple, non-demanding tasks can actually lead to quicker adaptation to hidden patterns compared to when you're intensely focused on that same simple task.
So zoning out can actually help you learn things sometimes? That seems wrong.
That's what the study implies, but specifically for these simple pattern-finding tasks. It doesn't necessarily hold for complex, demanding tasks. They used EEG data, which showed slow brain waves during mind wandering, similar to light sleep states. The theory is this state might confer some kind of learning advantage in these less demanding scenarios.
Interesting.
It really challenges the conventional wisdom that absolute, unwavering focus is always the best state for learning anything. Maybe sometimes letting go helps.
That is such a fascinating range we've covered just now, from market forecasts and the complex challenges of huge companies like Apple and Nintendo to how our brains might learn when they're not really paying attention, and these surprising potential shifts in religious belief.
It truly has been a comprehensive look across a rapidly evolving landscape. We've covered immense technological leaps with bio and quantum computing and advanced AI, navigated the complex and sometimes, frankly, volatile geopolitical landscape involving modern warfare, drone proliferation, nuclear tensions, and space competition. Explored the ever-changing markets and business world, including specific investment ideas and major corporate challenges, and even touched on these subtle but potentially significant shifts in society, work, and how we even learn and organize ourselves.
It's clear from looking at all these sources together that the world isn't just changing, it feels like it's accelerating and becoming more interconnected in multiple directions at once. Seeing how these seemingly separate topics connect, AI and biotech raising ethical questions that then feed into regulation debates, global conflicts immediately impacting energy markets and highlighting technological reliance, or automation changing the workforce and prompting new ideas about what constitutes solid work, it gives you a much richer understanding of the forces at play.
Yes, absolutely. These sources provide crucial pieces of a larger, very complex puzzle. Understanding the persistent technical challenges in trying to land on the moon, the sheer potential but also the risks of AI breakthroughs, the nuances of geopolitical tension in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, or even the surprising shifts in social trends like religiosity. It all contributes to navigating the future landscape more effectively, seeing the connections.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder, drawing on that thread of unexpected change and complexity running through all these sources we've unpacked. In a world where AI can learn complex math that challenges experts, where lab-grown brain cells can power computers, where even letting your mind wander might have hidden benefits, and where long-held societal trends are showing unexpected reversals. What fundamental assumptions are you holding on to about how the world works or how the future will unfold that might need some serious reevaluating based on everything we've discussed today? Thank you for bringing us this absolutely fascinating snack of sources for today's deep dive. Really thought-provoking stuff.
It was a genuine pleasure exploring them with you. Lots to think about.
Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.